People often throw away a rusted key because they think it is useless, forgetting that it might be the only thing capable of unlocking the treasures of time. The rain in Boone's Hollow fell in cold, heavy sheets, dropping the temperature to a bitter 42 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The sky over the Kentucky Valley was a pitch-black canvas of rolling thunder and oppressive shadows. At the edge of town, the neon sign of the Shady Pines Assisted Living Facility flickered with a sickly yellow hum. On the ground floor, at the far end of the cheap vinyl-sided building, a narrow window slowly groaned open. Silas Abernathy pushed his broad shoulders through the narrow frame. He was 77 years old. His knuckles were swollen, his joints stiffened by decades of relentless, bone-crushing labor. Yet his movements were deliberate and completely silent. Rainwater immediately lashed at his faded plaid flannel shirt, but he did not flinch. He gripped the aluminum windowsill with hands that felt like heavy, calloused leather. He lowered himself. His boots hit the muddy grass outside with a soft, squelching thud. Pain flared instantly. It shot like jagged shards of glass up from his knees, radiating through his lower back, a brutal reminder of his age and the arthritis that chewed at his bones. He tightened his jaw. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, breathing out a long, silent stream of white vapor into the freezing air. He did not groan. He did not cry. He simply adjusted the collar of his soaking jacket, turned his back on the flickering yellow light of the nursing home, and began to walk. Every step was a heavy drag through 3 inches of thick, unforgiving mud. But the physical struggle was nothing compared to the quiet devastation echoing inside his mind. He had not belonged in that place. The air inside Shady Pines always smelled of bleach, ammonia, and boiled cabbage. It was a holding pen for the forgotten, a waiting room for death, built with cheap drywall and hollow doors. Silas was a man of solid oak and heavy steel. For 50 years, he had worked as a maintenance engineer for the regional railway, driving heavy iron spikes into wooden ties under the blistering summer sun, laying miles of track across the unforgiving American frontier. 50 years. That was also how long he had been married to his wife, Martha. Together, they had built their family home from the ground up, resting on 2 acres of lush, rolling land just a few miles south of town. Silas had cut the timber himself. He had driven every nail, poured the concrete foundation, and sanded the porch planks until they were smooth as glass. It was a home built on blood, sweat, and quiet devotion. They had lived modestly, saving every spare penny, sacrificing their own comforts to pay the exorbitant college tuition for their only son, Vance. The name left a bitter, metallic taste in the old man's mouth. Vance was 50 years old now, a slick real estate broker operating out of a shiny office in the city, wearing Italian suits that cost more than Silas used to make in a month. Silas had bought his son that education. He had bought him the polished vocabulary and the sharp, calculating mind that Vance eventually turned against him. The betrayal came under the guise of grief. It happened 6 months ago, on the day of Martha's funeral. The rain had been falling just like tonight. Silas had stood over the fresh dirt of his wife's grave, his heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, though his weathered face remained an unreadable mask of stone. Vance had approached Silas after the service, smelling of expensive cologne and holding a leather briefcase. "Dad, I know it's hard right now, but we need to handle Mom's estate taxes before the state penalizes us," Vance had murmured smoothly, placing a heavy hand on his father's trembling shoulder. Silas, blinded by a quiet, suffocating sorrow, had looked down at the stack of dense legal papers. He trusted his blood. He trusted the boy he had raised. With a heavy, exhausted sigh, Silas had taken the gold pen from Vance's perfectly manicured fingers and signed his name. It was not a tax document. It was a full, irrevocable power of attorney. Within exactly 7 days, the truth revealed itself. Vance moved swiftly, ruthlessly. He sold the oak-framed house that Silas had built with his bare hands. He liquidated the small savings accounts. He changed the locks while Silas was visiting Martha's grave. When Silas returned, his key no longer worked. Vance stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his expensive suit, looking down at the man who gave him life with cold, dead eyes. "It is for your own good, old man," Vance stated coldly. "You cannot take care of yourself anymore. I've arranged a place for you." That place was Shady Pines, a cheap state-funded facility where Vance had dumped him like a broken piece of furniture, pocketing the hundreds of thousands of dollars from the estate. Now, standing in the pouring rain, Silas reached into the front pocket of his wet trousers. His thick, dirt-stained fingers traced the edges of his worn leather wallet. He pulled it open, shielding it from the downpour. Inside, damp and crumpled, were a few bills. $45. It was the only money he had left in the entire world, the absolute sum of a lifetime of grueling labor. A lesser man would have collapsed right there in the mud. A lesser man would have screamed at the sky, cursed God, and wept for the sheer staggering injustice of it all. Silas just carefully folded the wet bills, slid the wallet back into his pocket, and looked out toward the dark highway. His face was a portrait of iron resolve. Stripped of everything at 77 years old, Silas walked into the freezing night with only soaking wet clothes to his name. He did not know that the darkest abyss he was about to enter would be the very place where the light of destiny was waiting.
The sun rose over the Kentucky ridges like a pale, bruised eye. Silas opened his eyes. He was lying rigidly across the cracked vinyl back seat of a rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck. The cabin was freezing, the temperature hovering barely above 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with the smell of old motor oil and damp cloth. Vance had taken the house, the 50 acres of land, and the joint bank accounts. He had not taken the truck. It was practically worthless, with 250,000 miles on the engine and a transmission that whined like a dying dog. To Vance, it was an embarrassing piece of trash. To Silas, it was a steel sanctuary. Slowly, painfully, the old man sat up. His bones ached with a deep, grinding throb. He did not rub his stiff knees. He did not curse his son. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills from the night before. He smoothed them out against his knee, pressing his heavy thumbs over the creased paper, one by one. $45. It was a pathetic sum. It was the absolute final tally of a lifetime of honest labor. Silas folded the bills neatly, placed them back into his leather wallet, and turned the ignition key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the Owsley County Courthouse was buzzing with predatory energy. The foreclosure auction was a feeding frenzy for local developers and slick investors looking to flip cheap land. Men in pressed wool suits and expensive leather shoes stood in tight circles, sipping hot coffee and holding clipboards. They were men who made their fortunes by moving numbers on a page, never by callousing their hands. They reminded him of Vance. Silas walked up the concrete steps. He was still wearing the damp, mud-stained flannel from the night before. He smelled of rain, old sweat, and wet earth. Heads turned instantly as he entered the warm main hall. noses wrinkled in open disgust. A few younger investors snickered behind their hands, viewing the limping, dirt-streaked old man as a local vagrant who had wandered in to escape the biting cold. Silas ignored them completely. He stood perfectly still at the back of the room, his rough hands resting calmly at his sides. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a shiny bald head, rattled through the morning listings. Suburban houses, fertile farms, and commercial lots were snapped up quickly for tens of thousands of dollars. Then came the dregs. "Lot 44, the auctioneer announced, looking down at his ledger with a dismissive sigh. "The old town post office over on Creek Road, abandoned since 1952. Half an acre of land, structure is severely compromised, roof caved in, extensive rot and pest infestation. Do I hear an opening bid of $500? Silence filled the room. "I would not pay $5 for that rat trap," someone in the front row laughed out loud. $200? The auctioneer tried again, wiping sweat from his forehead. $100? Nothing. The investors shook their heads in unison. The property was a notorious eyesore, a garbage tomb of rusted corrugated steel and rotting wood that would cost thousands of dollars just to demolish. It was a worthless black hole. "Any bid at all?" the auctioneer asked, raising his heavy wooden gavel. $8, a deep, gravelly voice cut through the murmurs from the very back of the room. The entire hall turned around. Silas stood tall, his weathered face completely blank, his dark eyes locked on the wooden podium. The silence shattered into roaring laughter. Well-dressed men chuckled into their coffee cups. They pointed openly at the filthy old man buying a pile of garbage with pocket change. $8, the auctioneer repeated, shaking his head and trying to suppress a mocking smirk. "Going once, going twice, sold." Silas did not blink. He walked up the center aisle, the crowd parting for him with mocking bows and whispered insults. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the smoothed bills, and counted out $8 onto the polished mahogany table. He signed the county deed with a steady hand, took the yellowed paper, and walked out of the double doors without looking back. He climbed back into the freezing truck. He had exactly $37 left to his name. He put the truck in gear and drove 3 miles down the desolate stretch of Creek Road. The landscape turned wild, overgrown with thick brambles and towering weeds. Through the morning mist, the rusted silhouette of the post office emerged. It was a skeleton of decay. Thick green vines choked the rusted siding, and the sagging roof looked ready to collapse under the weight of single heavy raindrop. It was a monument to ruin. Silas parked the truck in the muddy yard and killed the engine. With $37 remaining, he stepped out into the freezing mud and walked toward the property everyone called a garbage tomb. But as he pushed open the rotting wooden doors and stepped inside, his sharp, weathered eyes immediately caught something.
The interior of the building was a masterclass in decay. Thick, twisting veins of poison ivy had crawled through the shattered window panes, wrapping their green, suffocating fingers around the rusted metal sorting racks and dragging them down toward the damp earth. The floor was a treacherous map of rotted kine boards, completely eaten through by decades of relentless termite colonies. The stench was almost physical. It was a heavy, suffocating cloud of ammonia from generations of bat guano, mixed with the sour tang of wet rust and dead leaves. A rusted iron chandelier, heavy with decades of undisturbed dust, hung perilously by a single frayed wire from the sagging ceiling, exactly 12 feet above. Any other man would have walked out. Vance would have taken one look at the crumbling drywall, smelled the thick rot, and immediately called a demolition crew with heavy bulldozers to crush the failure into dust. Silas stepped deeper into the shadows. He did not pinch his nose against the foul air. He did not let out a heavy sigh of defeat or curse the $8 he had just spent. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned the wreckage not with disgust, but with the cold, calculating precision of a master engineer. He was looking past the superficial rot. He ignored the peeling paint, the collapsed plaster, and the shattered glass crunching softly under his heavy leather work boots. He was looking for the bones. He reached down into the debris and pulled a rusted 3-foot iron rebar pipe from a pile of collapsed roofing tiles. He walked slowly toward the center of the dark room, his boots navigating the holes in the floor with careful, deliberate steps. He stopped in front of the main load-bearing pillar. It was covered in a thick, repulsive layer of black mold and rotting plaster. Silas swung the heavy iron pipe. He struck the center of the pillar with a tremendous amount of force. There was no hollow crunch. There was no shower of decaying splinters or collapsing dust. Instead, the iron pipe bounced back with a sharp, violent recoil, vibrating fiercely up Silas's thick arm. The sound that echoed through the empty chamber was a deep, resonant, and incredibly solid thud. A slight, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his weathered mouth. He stepped forward and used his thick fingers to peel back a large, wet chunk of the ruined plaster. Beneath the superficial layer of disgusting black rot, the true core of the building revealed itself. It was solid, old-growth white oak. It was wood harvested over a century ago, wood so dense and rich with its own natural oils that time and moisture had entirely failed to penetrate its heart. The skeleton was completely intact. Silas moved systematically through the 2,000 square feet of the ruined post office. He spent the next 3 hours testing the physical limits of the forgotten structure. He struck every vertical support beam, tapped every horizontal joist spanning the wide ceiling, and kicked away the loose, wet soil around the outer perimeter to carefully examine the base. He knelt in the mud. He brushed away decades of dead leaves to reveal a foundation made of massive interlocking river stones. They had been hauled by hand from the nearby riverbed, perfectly leveled and bound with horsehair mortar that had cured over 70 years into a substance harder than modern concrete. The building had stood through 70 brutal Appalachian winters, torrential spring floods, and vicious summer storms that routinely tore modern siding off the cheap suburban houses Vance sold for a living. The outer skin of this post office was undeniably dead. The corrugated steel roof was rusted beyond repair, the cosmetic drywall was completely dissolved into mush, and the interior was a graveyard of forgotten, rusted junk. But the foundation had not shifted a single inch. Underneath the omniscient gaze of time, there was a profound, silent poetry in this forsaken place. The old post office was an exact structural mirror of the man standing inside it. Silas Abernathy had been stripped of his outer life. His money was gone, his home was stolen by his own flesh and blood, and his dignity had been mocked by men in expensive suits who thought they understood value. Society looked at a 77-year-old man and deemed him a useless, rotting liability meant to be locked away in a cheap nursing home until he stopped breathing. They were completely wrong. His muscles still held the iron strength of 50 years of grueling railway labor. His mind was sharper than any polished real estate broker sitting in a climate-controlled office in the city. His moral foundation, built on decades of silent sacrifice and stoic endurance, had never fractured under the crushing weight of his son's betrayal. He was battered, entirely isolated, and down to his last $37. But he was not broken. He stood in the cavernous, rotting room and looked up at the gray sky showing through the gaping holes in the rusted roof. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving a profound, heavy silence lingering in the valley. He dropped the heavy iron pipe onto the dirt floor. He had work to do. The skeleton of the post office was still alive, and Silas began the work of resurrecting it, completely unaware that this building was cradling a historical secret that all of America had forgotten.
The work began at dawn. It was a punishing, relentless rhythm of destruction and clearing that demanded every ounce of his remaining strength. He had no power tools, no gasoline generator, and absolutely no help. He had a rusted steel crowbar, a heavy iron claw hammer he found buried in the dirt, and 2 calloused hands. Silas started with the floor. The rotted pine boards had to be ripped out completely. It was brutal. He crawled on his hands and knees over the jagged, splintered wood, wedging the cold iron crowbar under the rusted nail heads. For decades, those iron nails had fused with the wood, locking together in a stubborn embrace of oxidation and time. Every single plank required a tremendous, agonizing exertion of sheer physical will. His muscles burned. His arthritic joints screamed in a high-pitched agony that radiated from his shoulders all the way down his spine. He did not stop. He pulled one nail, then another, then another. He ripped up thousands of pounds of rotting timber, dragging it out into the yard, yard by yard, building a massive pile of decay under the open sky. As the weeks bled into one another, the bitter cold of the Kentucky spring gave way to the suffocating, oppressive heat of the southern summer. By late July, the valley was a baking oven. The temperature inside the hollowed-out post office frequently soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was a thick, invisible wool blanket that made drawing a breath feel like inhaling hot water. Sweat poured off his brow. It stung his eyes, soaking through his filthy flannel shirt until the heavy fabric clung to his ribs like a second skin. He drank lukewarm water from a plastic gallon jug he refilled at a gas station 2 miles down the road. His diet consisted entirely of cold canned beans, stale bread, and cheap peanut butter bought with the last few dollars of his $37 fortune. He was losing weight. His face grew gaunt, his cheekbones casting deep, sharp shadows across his weathered skin. His hands, already battered by a lifetime of railway work, became a map of fresh cuts, deep purple bruises and cracked blisters that wept clear fluid into the dirt. He never uttered a single complaint. While his son, Vance, sat in a 72-degree Fahrenheit climate-controlled office 50 miles away, wearing a $2,000 Italian suit and sipping iced coffee while aggressively negotiating the sale of his stolen childhood home, Silas was bleeding in the mud. Vance's hands were soft. They were the pale, unblemished hands of a man who manipulated paper, lied through his perfect teeth, and viewed the elderly as nothing more than inconvenient financial liabilities. Silas's hands were tools of creation. They were stained black with century-old dust, grease, and his own dried blood. Yet there was a profound, quiet dignity in his suffering. When he missed a nail, and the heavy steel hammer smashed directly into his left thumb, crushing the nail bed instantly into a dark, throbbing purple, Silas did not throw the hammer. He did not scream at the suffocating heat. He did not curse his wretched son. He simply closed his eyes. He took one long, slow breath through his nose. He wrapped a dirty rag around the bleeding digit, pulled it tight with his teeth, and picked the hammer right back up. The pain was a living thing, but pain was honest. It was far more honest than the slick, empty promises of a treacherous child. Every night, Silas slept in the cramped, suffocating cab of the 1998 Ford pickup truck. His legs were cramped against the rusted doors. His back ached with a deep, throbbing fire. He would stare up at the moon through the dirty windshield, listening to the crickets chirping in the tall grass, and quietly plan out the next day of labor. He was completely alone. So he thought. On the 42nd day of his grueling isolation, the heavy crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning silence. Silas was up on the roof.
He was straddling a wooden joist 30 feet in the air, carefully securing a salvaged sheet of tin over a gaping hole. He paused, wiping a thick forearm across his dripping forehead, and looked down at the muddy yard. A beat-up, faded blue Chevrolet flatbed truck had just rolled to a stop next to his Ford. The driver's door groaned open. Out stepped Elias Thorne. Elias was 65 years old, a quiet, lean man with a face like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. He owned the local hardware and lumber supply store in the center of town. It was a dusty, failing business, rapidly being choked out by the massive corporate chain stores out on the highway. Silas watched silently from above. He gripped his hammer tightly. He had absolutely no money left. If this man was here to collect property taxes or enforce some forgotten county zoning ordinance, Silas had nothing to give him but a blank stare and empty pockets. Elias did not look up. He simply walked to the back of his flatbed truck, unlatched the heavy steel tailgate, and began pulling things out. First came 2 heavy wooden crates. Then came a stack of thick, rough-cut lumber. Finally, he pulled out a large, steaming, insulated thermos and a brown paper bag stained with fresh grease. Elias set everything down on a relatively dry patch of concrete near the entrance. He looked up at the old man balancing on the roof joists. "You were going to kill yourself up there without proper bracing," Elias called out, his voice a calm, steady rumble. Silas did not reply. He slowly climbed down the rickety wooden ladder, his boots making heavy, tired thuds until his feet hit the dirt floor. He walked over to the pile of supplies. There were at least 50 board feet of solid pine planks. There were 20 pounds of 3-inch galvanized steel nails. There was a brand new forged steel crowbar. "I cannot pay you for this," Silas stated flatly, his voice raw from disuse. Elias wiped his grease-stained hands on his denim overalls. He looked around the gutted interior of the post office, taking in the massive piles of cleared debris, the carefully stacked salvageable wood, and the sheer, impossible volume of work one elderly man had accomplished in 6 weeks. He looked back at Silas. He saw the dirty rags wrapped around the bleeding fingers. He saw the gaunt, hollow cheeks. "Did not ask for your money," Elias replied softly. "I don't take charity," Silas warned, his jaw tightening with stubborn pride. Elias let out a dry, quiet chuckle. He reached out and tapped the stack of pine boards. "This is not charity, old man," Elias murmured quietly, his eyes meeting Silas's dark, exhausted gaze. "This wood has been sitting in the back of my lot for 3 years. It is slightly warped. The big contractors won't touch it. The corporate guys laugh at it. They call it useless scrap." He paused, his expression turning entirely serious. "Wood is scrap, just like us," Elias stated firmly, pointing a calloused finger at the boards. "But it still has plenty of strength left if you know how to place it. You take the nails, you take the wood, and you eat that hot chicken in the bag before it gets cold." Silas stared at the other man for a long, silent moment. In a world that had violently stripped him of his family, his home, and his dignity, this sudden, unprompted act of kindness from a stranger felt like a physical blow. A lesser man might have wept. Silas merely gave a single, slow nod. "Thank you," Silas whispered roughly. "I'll bring more warped boards next week," Elias noted calmly, turning back to his truck. "Keep the roof from falling on your stubborn head." Elias drove away, leaving a thick cloud of dust in his wake.
The work continued. Fueled by the hot meals Elias dropped off twice a week and armed with the reclaimed lumber and solid steel nails, Silas accelerated his pace. The transformation was slow, agonizing, but undeniably real. Month 2 bled into month 3. The massive holes in the roof were patched, sealed tightly against the violent summer thunderstorms that frequently rolled through the valley. The rotted floorboards were entirely replaced by the thick, warped pine planks Elias provided, creating a sturdy, uneven, but beautifully solid surface to walk upon. Silas scrubbed the black mold from the original white oak pillars using a mixture of vinegar and river water, revealing the rich golden grain hidden beneath decades of filth. The garbage tomb was vanishing. A building was breathing once again. The local townspeople who drove past the property on Creek Road began to slow down. The teenagers who used to throw glass bottles at the rusted siding now stared in quiet disbelief. The pathetic, dirty old man they had laughed out of the auction house was systematically pulling a dead structure out of the grave with his bare, bleeding hands. By the end of August, the intense heat began to break, giving way to the cooler, golden afternoons of late summer. Silas moved to the back of the building. The final major obstacle in the main room was the massive, decaying sorting counter. It was a heavy, bolted-down structure of thick oak and rusted iron grates where postal workers had once sorted mail by hand. It spanned almost 15 feet across the back wall, completely blocking access to a dark, recessed alcove. Silas approached it with his new steel crowbar. He needed the space. He jammed the forged steel tip of the crowbar under the thick baseboard of the counter, leaned his entire body weight into the heavy iron, and pushed down. The wood groaned violently. Decades of accumulated dust plumed into the stagnant air. Silas coughed, waving a hand in front of his face, and pushed harder. His muscles strained, the veins in his neck bulging as he fought the stubborn architecture. With a loud, cracking snap, the front panel of the counter gave way. It tore completely off its rusted hinges, crashing heavily onto the newly laid pine floor. Silas stepped back, wiping the sweat from his eyes, and picked up a heavy battery-powered flashlight Elias had left for him. He clicked it on. The bright white beam cut through the thick clouds of swirling dust. Silas stepped over the fallen debris and walked into the narrow, claustrophobic space behind the counter. It was a dead end. There was a solid wall of thick, vertical oak panels blocking his path. But as Silas shined the light across the heavy wooden planks, his sharp eyes noticed something extremely unusual. The spacing was wrong. The iron nails holding these specific panels were entirely different from the square-headed iron nails used everywhere else in the building. These panels had been added later. They were hiding something. Silas raised the heavy steel crowbar, took a deep breath, and drove the sharp iron wedge forcefully between the two thick wooden planks. He threw his weight backward. The wood splintered with a sharp, echoing crack, revealing a deep, pitch-black void hidden entirely inside the false wall. Silas pushed the flashlight into the gaping hole. The beam illuminated the dark, forgotten space, crawling over thick layers of heavy spider webs and a thick blanket of undisturbed gray dust. He reached his heavy arm inside to tear away another piece of the broken wood. As he yanked the heavy plank forward, the iron shaft of his crowbar violently struck an object hidden deep within the dark void. It was not wood. It was not stone. After 3 months of blood and sweat, the old post office had finally taken shape. But in the dim afternoon shadows, as the heavy iron of his crowbar forcefully connected with a rigid, unyielding object hidden entirely inside the false wall, the sharp, unmistakable sound of solid metal ringing against metal echoed loudly through the completely empty building. The sharp, ringing, metallic clank vibrated heavily through the floorboards. Silas lowered the heavy, forged steel crowbar. He directed the bright, focused beam of his battery-powered flashlight directly into the shattered opening of the false wall. The hidden cavity was approximately 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, completely sealed off from the rest of the building. The trapped air pouring out of the dark void was incredibly stale, devoid of all moisture, carrying the faint, sweet, unmistakable scent of ancient paper and dried wax. He used his calloused hands to tear away the remaining jagged oak planks. Splinters bit deep into his palms. He ignored them entirely. He stepped over the rotted wood and into the suffocating darkness of the hidden alcove.
Sweeping the pale light across the dust-choked floor, the beam suddenly stopped, illuminating 3 massive rectangular shapes resting silently against the back brick foundation. They were trunks. Heavy, flat-topped wooden shipping trunks bound securely in thick brass straps. They were completely covered in a dense, suffocating blanket of gray dust at least 2 inches thick. Heavy cast-iron padlocks secured the thick leather straps on the front of each wooden box. The old leather had completely petrified over the decades, turning into something resembling brittle black stone, and the iron locks themselves were fused solid by generations of aggressive oxidation. They had been sitting in total, undisturbed darkness for nearly a century. Silas set the heavy flashlight down on a dry wooden ledge. He reached down and picked up his forged steel crowbar. He wedged the sharp iron tip directly into the hasp of the first rusted padlock. He did not rush. He did not let the sudden rush of adrenaline or curiosity quicken his steady, methodical breathing. He simply set his boots firmly against the stone floor, braced his thick shoulders, and applied a tremendous amount of raw, calculated leverage. The rusted padlock snapped. It broke with a sharp, violent crack that echoed loudly against the cavernous wooden walls. Silas stepped sideways and repeated the exact same brutal motion on the second trunk. Then he stepped to the third. He dropped the crowbar. With thick, heavily scarred fingers, he gripped the cold brass handle of the first rusted trunk and pulled violently upward. The heavy wooden lid shrieked on its oxidized hinges, loudly protesting the sudden shocking intrusion of light and moving air after decades of absolute silence. The trunk was packed to the very brim. Inside lay dozens of heavy, tightly woven canvas bags. They were completely sealed. The openings were folded over tightly, wrapped in thick hemp twine, and heavily coated in thick layers of dark red waterproof wax. Stamped boldly across the faded olive-green canvas in thick black ink was the official, unmistakable emblem of the United States Postal Service. Beneath the eagle emblem, a date was clearly printed. October 12, 1918. Silas stared silently at the printed numbers. 1918, the brutal, bloody climax of the First World War, the terrifying peak of the deadly Spanish flu pandemic that had mercilessly swept across the globe, wiping out entire isolated towns in the American Midwest and the deep Appalachian valleys. These were undelivered letters. They were thousands of final messages, tragic wartime casualty notices, and desperate tear-stained prayers that had been deliberately hidden away by a local postmaster who likely succumbed to the very plague he was desperately trying to outrun. Time had simply swallowed them whole. Silas opened the second trunk. More canvas bags, more perfectly sealed history. He moved silently to the third trunk. He lifted the heavy wooden lid. The top layer contained identical wax-sealed canvas bags, perfectly preserved by the dry, heavily cedar-lined interior of the box. Silas carefully lifted the heavy canvas bags out one by one, stacking them gently onto the newly laid pine floor. Each individual bag weighed nearly 20 pounds. At the very bottom of the third trunk, resting completely alone against the bare cedar wood, lay something entirely different. It was a large, flat portfolio. It was beautifully crafted from thick, dark brown calfskin leather, measuring roughly 14 inches wide and 18 inches long. There was absolutely no dust on it. The premium leather was incredibly supple, perfectly protected beneath the heavy canvas mailbags for over 100 years. Silas picked it up. It was surprisingly light. He carried the leather folder out of the suffocating alcove and walked slowly toward the front of the resurrected post office, where the late afternoon sun poured warmly through the patched windows, casting long golden beams across the clean pine floor. He sat down heavily on an overturned wooden crate. He placed the leather portfolio on his lap.
With slow, deliberate movements, his battered, bleeding fingers untied the thin leather laces binding it closed. He opened the heavy cover. Inside, nestled securely between pristine sheets of protective translucent wax paper, were dozens of immaculate, mint-condition postage stamps. They were not loose singles, they were full, entirely unseparated sheets of vintage postage, radiating brilliant, utterly unfaded colors of deep carmine red, deep ultramarine blue, and vibrant forest green. Silas was a retired railway engineer, not a historian. He did not know the obsessive, highly lucrative intricacies of global philately. He did not know that a single piece of perforated paper from the late 19th century could easily buy a massive suburban estate. But as his dark, weathered eyes calmly scanned the vibrant pages, one specific sheet, securely tucked near the very back of the folder, made him stop entirely. It was a pristine sheet of exactly 100 stamps. They were printed in striking carmine red and deep blue. The denomination, marked clearly in the corner, read 24 cents. The central image of the stamp depicted a military biplane, a Curtiss JN-4 aircraft, famously used to carry the very first airmail during the Great War. But something was terribly wrong with the picture. The airplane was completely upside down. The ornate red frame stood perfectly upright, but the blue airplane in the very center was plummeting downward toward the earth, printed flawlessly and undeniably in the absolute wrong direction. Silas ran his rough, thickly calloused thumb lightly over the protective wax paper. He stared silently at the 100 upside-down biplanes. He did not gasp, he did not smile. He simply closed the heavy leather portfolio, methodically retied the delicate laces with his bruised fingers, and looked out the window at the setting sun. He was a stoic man who deeply understood the fundamental value of a solid stone foundation and a heavy iron nail. He had absolutely no idea that he was casually holding a full, pristine sheet of the legendary inverted Jenny, one of the most famous, historically significant, and devastatingly rare printing errors in the entire history of the world. He did not know what those tiny pieces of paper were truly worth, until a top valuation expert from Chicago stepped into the wooden cabin, placed a magnifying glass over his eye, and began to tremble violently.
The Owsley County Public Library was a quiet brick building situated precisely 8 miles north of the rusted post office. Silas drove there in his freezing 1998 Ford pickup truck. He sat down at a sticky public computer terminal, typing slowly with his stiff, bruised fingers, attached 3 blurry photographs taken with a disposable camera to a brief email directed to the American Philatelic Society in Chicago. He drove back to his dirt floor. He resumed his labor. Exactly 48 hours later, a sleek black Lincoln Town car rolled onto the uneven gravel of Creek Road. It stopped abruptly in the muddy yard. The passenger door opened. Out stepped Arthur Sterling. Sterling was a senior valuation director. He wore a tailored charcoal wool suit, polished Oxford shoes, and carried a heavy titanium briefcase. He was a man accustomed to vaulted auction houses and pristine private galleries, yet as he stepped into the humid Kentucky air, he did not sneer at the dirt. He did not pinch his nose. He walked directly into the meticulously cleared post office. Silas sat calmly on an overturned wooden crate. The heavy leather portfolio rested on a solid pine table he had built from scrap lumber. He did not stand up to greet the wealthy man. "Mr. Abernathy," Sterling breathed softly, his eyes immediately locking onto the leather folder. "Have a look," Silas replied flatly. Sterling set his titanium briefcase onto the rough wood. His hands moved with desperate, frantic precision. He withdrew a pair of pristine white cotton gloves and a powerful jeweler's magnifying glass. He opened the heavy leather cover. The expert did not speak for a full 20 minutes. The silence inside the old building was absolute. Sterling slowly turned the translucent wax pages, his magnified eye completely absorbing the vibrant carmine red and deep ultramarine blue inks. When he finally reached the back of the portfolio, he stopped breathing. His gloved hands began to tremble violently. "My God," Sterling whispered faintly. He slowly lowered the magnifying glass. He looked around the resurrected wooden walls of the forgotten building. The old postmaster of Boone's Hollow died suddenly in November of 1918. The Spanish flu wiped out half this county. He must have hidden the outgoing wartime mail and his private collection to protect them from looters or quarantine fires. They have been sitting exactly here, in the dark, for over 100 years. Silas simply nodded his head. He waited. Sterling slowly removed his white cotton gloves and placed them carefully onto the table. He looked directly into the dark, stoic eyes of the 77-year-old man wearing a filthy, sweat-stained flannel shirt. "Mr. Abernathy," Sterling stated clearly, his voice thick with raw emotion. "A single block of 4 inverted Jenny stamps is considered a crown jewel of any global collection. You possess a complete, flawless sheet of 100. Along with the pristine wartime correspondence, this is a historic discovery of unprecedented magnitude." Sterling paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his pale forehead. "The absolute minimum insurance valuation for this portfolio," Sterling declared firmly, "is $4,500,000. The number hung heavily in the dusty air. $4.5 million. It was a sum that shattered reality. It was enough money to buy the entire town, pave the muddy roads, and burn the Shady Pines nursing home straight to the ground. Silas did not gasp. He did not leap from his wooden crate. He did not shed a single tear of joy. He slowly reached out, picked up his lukewarm mug of black coffee, and took a quiet sip. He looked down at his deeply scarred, bruised, and permanently calloused hands, the hands that had rebuilt the rotting foundation while the rest of the world had discarded him like trash. "I see," Silas muttered calmly. "But secrets of this massive, historic scale are impossible to contain. The whispers leaked from the library, from the town hall, and from the Chicago auction house. The news of the 77-year-old millionaire living inside a rusted post office spread across the state like a vicious, uncontrollable wildfire. And, like a starving vulture smelling fresh blood on the wind, the man who had thrown Silas into the dirt was already speeding down the highway.
The heavy crunch of expensive tires violently shattered the quiet morning peace of the valley. A silver 2-door Mercedes-Benz rolled down the uneven, deeply rutted gravel of Creek Road. The luxury vehicle sat entirely out of place in the wild Kentucky landscape. It swerved to avoid a large pothole, its polished chrome bumpers immediately coated in a thick layer of damp red mud. The car came to an aggressive halt just 10 yards from the front porch of the resurrected oak building. The engine died. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and Vance Abernathy stepped out. He was wearing a tailored navy blue wool suit, a crisp white silk shirt, and $2,000 Italian leather loafers that immediately sank 1 full inch into the wet dirt. From the passenger side emerged his wife, Brenda, her neck draped in heavy gold jewelry that caught the morning light. Silas was sitting on the wide front porch. He was resting comfortably in a rocking chair he had built entirely from reclaimed pine. He was holding a chipped ceramic mug filled with steaming black coffee. He did not stand up. He did not wave. He did not say a single word.
Vance immediately launched into his carefully rehearsed performance. "Dad, thank God we finally found you," Vance cried out loudly, his voice dripping with a sickening manufactured desperation. He rushed forward, his arms outstretched as if to embrace the filthy, battered old man. He stopped just short of the porch steps, clearly unwilling to dirty his expensive suit against his father's sweat-stained flannel shirt. Brenda trailed closely behind him, clutching a designer leather handbag tightly against her chest, her face twisted into a mask of exaggerated, utterly hollow concern. "We have been looking everywhere for you, Silas," Brenda murmured sweetly, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "You disappeared in the middle of the night. We were absolutely terrified." Silas took a slow, quiet sip of his coffee. He stared directly through them. The silence stretching between them was heavy, suffocating, and brutally absolute. It was the silence of a mountain watching a storm pass by. It offered no forgiveness, no anger, and absolutely no quarter. Vance cleared his throat nervously, his fake smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. "Dad, you are clearly confused. Your mind is slipping. You wandered off and bought this dangerous, rotting pile of garbage. But do not worry, I am still your legal guardian. I am here to take you back to Shady Pines, where the nurses can properly monitor your condition. And of course, I will take full legal possession of the items you found here to ensure they are properly managed for the estate." He wanted the stamps. He had smelled the $4.5 million from 50 miles away, and he had come to strip the carcass completely bare. Silas set his ceramic mug down on the wooden railing. "You do not own this place," Silas stated calmly, his deep voice scraping like heavy iron over rough stone. Vance let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. His mask of filial concern instantly evaporated, revealing the cold, reptilian greed underneath. "I own you, old man," Vance snapped viciously, stepping up to the first wooden stair. "I hold the power of attorney. I control your medical decisions, your bank accounts, and every single piece of property you touch. You have zero legal capacity. If you do not get in that car right now, I will drag you into a federal courtroom, have a judge declare you entirely incompetent, and lock you in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable life." He sneered down at his father. "You are nothing but a broken old man playing in the dirt." The air grew icy. Silas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse the heavens or scream at the monster he had raised. He simply looked to his left. The heavy, solid oak door of the post office creaked open. Stepping out from the cool shadows of the restored interior was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that made Vance's expensive clothing look like cheap rags. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. "Mr. Vance Abernathy, I presume," the man stated coldly. Vance stumbled backward, his arrogant sneer instantly vanishing. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Marcus Harrison. I am the chief legal counsel for the Sterling International Auction House in Chicago, and as of yesterday morning, I am also the fully retained exclusive personal attorney for your father." Vance's face turned the color of dirty chalk. "He can't hire a lawyer," Vance stammered defensively, pointing a manicured finger at his father. "I hold his power of attorney." Harrison reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents. He did not hand them to Vance. He simply held them up in the morning light. "You hold a specific, conditionally limited power of attorney executed under extreme duress regarding the joint estate of Martha Abernathy," Harrison corrected sharply, his voice slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. "It does not cover sovereign transactions made entirely with unmingled cash. Your father purchased this county property at a public government auction for exactly $8. His name and his name alone is recorded on the sovereign deed.
This property and everything buried within its foundation belongs exclusively to him." Vance opened his mouth to speak, but the lawyer cut him off with a brutal, relentless efficiency. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper, "our firm has spent the last 48 hours thoroughly auditing your recent financial history. We have fully documented the fraudulent sale of your father's property. We have the forged tax documents you used to trick him. We have sworn affidavits from the nursing home staff detailing your strict orders to deny him adequate food and medical care." Vance began to sweat profusely. The moisture beaded on his forehead, rolling down his pale cheeks. Brenda took 3 rapid steps backward toward the silver car. "We are filing 72 separate federal charges against you," Harrison declared loudly, "including felony elder abuse, aggravated wire fraud, and grand larceny. You sold a home worth $300,000, pocketed the cash, and abandoned a 77-year-old man in the freezing rain." Harrison stepped down one stair, towering entirely over the trembling real estate broker. "The Sterling Auction House has authorized an unlimited, multi-million-dollar legal fund to completely destroy you. You will not see a courtroom for his assets. You will see a federal judge for your crimes. You are looking at a minimum of 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary." Vance was completely paralyzed. His polished, arrogant world had just been violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had come to steal a fortune from a helpless victim. He had walked directly into a heavily armed fortress. He looked up at his father. He expected to see gloating. He expected to see a triumphant, mocking smile. But Silas Abernathy merely looked down at his son with a profound, devastating pity. The old man possessed the quiet, unbreakable dignity of an ancient tree that had weathered 1,000 brutal storms. "Get off my land," Silas ordered quietly. It was not a yell. It was an absolute, final command. Vance did not say another word. He turned around, his shoulders completely slumped, his expensive Italian shoes dragging heavily through the thick mud. He climbed into the driver's seat of the silver car. Brenda practically threw herself into the passenger side. The engine roared to life, and the car aggressively reversed out of the yard, violently spinning its tires and spraying wet gravel into the tall grass as it fled back down the valley road in total, crushing humiliation. Silas watched them go. The silver car disappeared around the bend, leaving nothing but a thick cloud of red dust drifting slowly into the quiet morning sky.
The auction in Chicago lasted exactly 14 minutes. The pristine sheet of the inverted Jenny stamps, along with the perfectly preserved wartime letters, sparked a fierce global bidding war among anonymous billionaires. When the heavy brass gavel finally struck the mahogany podium, the final sale price reached $6,200,000. Silas did not buy a sprawling mansion. He did not buy luxury vehicles, Italian wool suits, or first-class tickets to distant islands. He drove his rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck straight back to Boone's Hollow. He walked directly into Elias Thorne's failing hardware store, placed a certified bank draft for $250,000 squarely on the dusty checkout counter, and quietly demanded an equal partnership. Elias wept silently. Silas just nodded, turned around, and went back to work. Over the next 12 months, the rusted garbage tomb completely transformed. Silas hired a small, dedicated crew of local carpenters, paying them triple the standard county wage, to fully restore the old post office. They replaced the rotting corrugated steel with a beautiful, heavy slate roof. They installed thick, double-paned glass windows to block the freezing winter winds, but Silas absolutely refused to cover the interior framework. The original white oak pillars remained entirely bare. The building became the Boone's Hollow Historical Museum. It was a quiet, perfectly climate-controlled sanctuary dedicated to the town's forgotten past, anchored by the beautiful, massive wooden sorting counter Silas had painstakingly rebuilt. He kept nothing for himself but a small, modest living quarter framed securely into the back of the property. He had everything he needed. It was a Tuesday morning in late May. The temperature was a mild 65 degrees Fahrenheit. A brilliant golden dawn broke over the Kentucky Valley, piercing the lingering gray mist and bathing the restored wooden structure in a warm amber light. Silas sat on his wide front porch. He rested comfortably in his handmade pine rocking chair. At his feet lay a scruffy three-legged hound dog he had found wandering, starving near the highway just a few weeks prior. The dog rested its heavy head gently across Silas's muddy boots, letting out a long, contented breath. Silas reached down. His hands were still heavily scarred, the knuckles permanently swollen from 50 years of crushing railway labor. He ran his thick, calloused fingers slowly through the dog's coarse fur. With his other hand, he lifted a chipped ceramic mug and took a slow, quiet sip of bitter black coffee. The valley was completely silent. People often walk past a rusted, broken thing and see only decay. They look at an abandoned building, an injured animal, or a 77-year-old man discarded by his own flesh and blood, and they call it useless trash. They measure a soul by the smoothness of its skin or the thickness of its wallet. They are entirely wrong. True value does not reside in the polished, superficial armor we show to the world. It lives deep inside the heavy stone foundations that refuse to shatter under immense pressure. It survives entirely inside the scarred, calloused hands that continue to build when everything else has been violently taken away. There is absolutely no such thing as a worthless life, just as there is no such thing as a rusted key that has completely lost its purpose. Sometimes the most profound treasures are simply waiting in the dark, waiting for the right hands to clear the dust away.